Most mornings now begin with a small feeling of defeat. You walk into the kitchen and the night before is still sitting there waiting for you. A pan is on the stove. Glasses are by the sink. The table has crumbs on it. A jacket is hanging on a chair that was never meant to hold clothes. Before breakfast is even made, the house is already reminding you what did not get finished. That feeling is so common now that many people barely notice it anymore. They just call it normal life. In many 1950s homes, the evening worked differently. The goal was not perfection. The goal was closure. Women were often managing small houses, limited storage, several family members, and long days without the help of modern gadgets or endless specialty products. Because of that, they could not afford to let the day remain scattered across the house once supper was over. They needed the home to settle back into itself before bedtime. The evening reset was not extra cleaning added on top of everything else. It was the final shape of the day. If old household wisdom like this matters to you, subscribe and stay with us. These quiet routines solved problems many homes still struggle with, and there is a lot more of that forgotten knowledge worth keeping alive. That is one of the biggest things modern life lost. We still clean, but often much later, much less consistently, and only when things start looking bad enough to force action. In many older homes, the work happened earlier and in smaller motions. A dish was washed before food dried onto it. A chair was pushed back once someone stood up. A towel was hung instead of dropped. A room was returned to order while the mess was still light enough to lift with one hand. The system worked because it kept small disorder from growing into a full morning problem. The kitchen usually carried the heart of this routine. Once dinner was done, the room did not stay emotionally open for the rest of the night. It began to close. Plates were gathered. Leftovers were handled before they turned into mystery bowls shoved to the back of the icebox. The table was cleared so it would be ready again by morning. The sink was not just a place where dirty things were abandoned. It was the place where the day was brought to an end. Even in homes where everything was not washed at once, there was usually some effort to make sure the room looked under control before the lights went out. That made a bigger difference than it sounds. A kitchen left half-finished does not stay in the kitchen. It changes the mood of the next morning. It makes breakfast feel late before it starts. It makes coffee feel delayed. It tells the first person awake that today has begun with yesterday still in the way. Older routines were often built to prevent exactly that feeling. The women following them were not performing some magic trick. They were protecting tomorrow while they still had energy left tonight. Did your mother or grandmother ever treat the kitchen like it had to be closed before bed? Many did. One finished task led quietly to another, and the room most likely to affect the next morning was always the first one brought back under control. Because once the kitchen was left undone, breakfast was already starting at a disadvantage. In many 1950s homes, the evening reset began with one simple idea. The kitchen had to be returned to working order before anyone could really consider the day finished. That did not mean it had to shine like a magazine photo. It meant it had to be ready to serve breakfast without first asking for rescue. That small difference mattered. A room can look decent and still be unprepared. The women who kept these kitchens running were often aiming for readiness more than appearance, and that is one reason the system held together so well. The sink usually stood at the center of it all. Dirty dishes were not just unpleasant to look at, they represented delay. The longer plates, cups, and pans sat there, the heavier the next morning became. Food dried, grease stiffened, water spots turned cloudy. One unfinished supper began turning into a task that felt twice as annoying by sunrise. So the evening routine tried to stop that growth while the mess was still fresh and manageable. Even a quick wash made a difference. Even stacking things neatly, rinsing them well, and clearing the basin changed the mood of the room. Leftovers were handled with the same logic. Food was covered, cooled, and put away while it still felt like part of supper, not an afterthought. In many homes, waste carried real guilt because money was tighter. Grocery trips were more planned, and every meal had to stretch a little farther. That meant the end of dinner was not truly over until the remaining food had been accounted for. A roast became tomorrow's sandwiches. Extra vegetables might appear beside eggs the next morning. What mattered was that nothing sat there in open bowls waiting to be forgotten. The kitchen was being reset not just for cleanliness, but for continuity. The table mattered too. Once the meal was done, crumbs were brushed away, dishes removed, and the surface returned to usefulness. In a smaller home, the kitchen table was rarely just for dinner. It might hold breakfast at dawn, schoolwork later, bills in the afternoon, or lunch preparation before noon. Leaving it cluttered overnight meant blocking one of the most useful working spaces in the house. That is something modern homes often struggle with. We have more counters, more cabinets, more gadgets, yet the basic surfaces are often crowded with yesterday's remains. Because there is no clear moment when the room is declared finished. Even the small details played a role. A wet dish towel was hung so it could dry properly instead of souring in a heap. The stove was wiped while splatters were still loose enough to lift easily. Crumbs on the floor were swept before they could become the first thing felt under bare feet in the morning. None of this was glamorous. That was the strength of it. These were not dramatic cleaning sessions. They were short, ordinary motions done at the right time, which is often more powerful than doing a bigger job later. Would your morning feel different if the kitchen was truly finished before you went to bed? For many women in that era, the answer would have been obvious. Because the evening kitchen was never just about the evening kitchen. It was about the tone of the next day. And even that was not enough on its own, because a clean sink could only do so much if the rest of the house still looked like the day had simply fallen where it stood. The evening reset did not end at the kitchen door. In many 1950s homes, once supper was cleared and the sink was under control, the rest of the house was gently pulled back into place. Before people disappeared into bedrooms for the night. This was one reason so many older homes felt calmer by morning. The mess had fewer chances to spread and settle. Objects were returned while they were still easy to notice, easy to lift, and easy to put where they belonged. The work was small because it happened before disorder had time to thicken. The living room often came first. Cushions were straightened. Folded blankets were draped back where they belonged. Newspapers and magazines were stacked instead of left drifting across tables and armrests. Cups were carried back out. Chairs were pushed into place. In some homes, ashtrays were emptied and wiped. None of that took very long, but it changed the feeling of the room. A family space that looked used and abandoned at night could look welcoming again in just a few minutes. That shift mattered, especially in smaller houses where every shared room stayed in view and could affect the mood of the whole home. The entryway mattered too, even when it was little more than a patch of floor near the door. Shoes were lined up or moved out of the path. Coats were hung. Handbags, lunch pails, school books, and loose papers were gathered before they became morning confusion. In a house without much extra room, clutter could not hide very well. It had to be dealt with, or it immediately began crowding daily life. That visibility was inconvenient in some ways, but it also forced a rhythm that kept things from piling up unnoticed for days. Clothing had its own part in the reset. Tomorrow's outfit might be chosen, or at least checked. Shoes were put away instead of kicked off wherever the evening ended. House dresses or aprons were folded, hung, or placed where they would be ready again. In homes where clothes had to last, care started before bedtime. Laundry also fit into this logic. The point was not always to complete a full wash at night. It was to keep clothing from becoming one shapeless heap that silently doubled while nobody was looking. The bathroom followed the same rule. Towels were hung properly. This simple reset kept homes spotless. The sink was wiped after washing up. Hairbrushes, cold cream jars, soap dishes, and other small items were put back where they belonged. A bathroom could be tiny and still feel orderly if each object had a clear resting place. That was true across the whole house. The order did not come from abundance. It came from return. That does not mean the era was easy. For many women, the same routines that created order also came with real pressure. A home was often treated as a measure of discipline, care, and even character. That burden was not light. But inside that pressure was a practical truth that still matters. When things are put back before night settles in, they do not greet the next day as unfinished business. And once the rooms were restored to themselves, the final step was not really about cleaning at all. It was about making sure the next morning would not begin by searching for what the night should have prepared. The deepest purpose of the 1950s evening reset was not really a cleaner sink or a straighter living room. It was protection. Women were trying to protect the next morning from confusion, delay, and that heavy feeling of beginning the day already behind. That is what made the routine so powerful. It was not just about putting things away. It was about preparing the first hour of tomorrow, while the house still had enough energy left to do it. In many homes, that final stretch of evening created the difference between a rushed morning and a steady one. That mindset showed up in small, practical ways. Breakfast items were thought about before bedtime instead of in the fog of dawn. Coffee might be set out and ready. A pan or bowl needed for the morning could be placed where it would be easy to reach. Lunches for work or school were often considered the night before, at least in part, because mornings with children, uniforms, chores, and schedules did not leave much room for searching and guessing. Even when a full meal was not prepared in advance, the decisions were often reduced before bed. That alone saved time, but it also saved something harder to measure. It saved mental strain. The same was true for clothes and personal items. Handbags were placed where they could be found. Keys were not left to wander. School items, papers, and lunch containers were gathered instead of scattered across different rooms. Tomorrow's dress, shoes, or work clothes might be chosen early, especially in homes where garments had to be kept neat and repeated carefully. These habits may sound modest, but that was the point. The women who lived this way were not usually trying to create some grand display of organization. They were removing tiny points of friction before those points could stack up and turn the morning into a scramble. This is one of the reasons so many older homes seemed calmer than they probably felt in real time. The calm was often built ahead of need. By the time the morning arrived, some of the choices had already been made, some of the surfaces had already been cleared, and some of the work had already been absorbed into the evening before. Today, many households live without that protective layer, and nights stretch much later now. Screens keep the day feeling open long after the useful part of the evening is gone. Takeout containers stay on counters, laundry waits in chairs, bags are dropped wherever people stop walking. Bigger homes can hide more clutter, but they can also delay the moment when anyone feels forced to reset it. The day never fully closes, so the next one never fully opens cleanly either. That does not mean modern families are careless. Life now is fast in different ways. Schedules are fragmented. Meals happen at odd hours. People come home tired and mentally crowded. Convenience has given relief in many places, but it has also removed old stopping points. There used to be clearer signals that the active part of the day was over. Supper was done. The dishes were handled. The rooms were straightened. Clothing was set aside. The lights went off on a house that had been brought back into some kind of readiness. Many homes no longer have that shared closing rhythm, and without it, disorder drifts forward into the next day almost by default. Which small evening habit would be hardest to bring back now? For some people, it would be clearing the sink. For others, it would be choosing clothes, setting the table just right for the morning, or returning the living room to order before bed. The good news is that the old system does not have to come back all at once to be useful again. The lesson was never that every woman in the 1950s had a perfect home. The lesson was that a few repeated actions, done at the right moment, could stop tomorrow from starting in retreat. That may be the real reason these homes seemed so spotless by morning. It was not magic. It was not better products. It was not that women from the past had endless time or endless patience. It was that the house was gently closed each night. The sink was emptied, the towel was hung, the table was cleared, the room was returned to itself. Morning light entered a space that had already been prepared to receive it. And maybe that is the part worth carrying forward. Not the pressure, not the idea that a home must look perfect to prove anything about the people inside it. Just the rhythm, just the small kindness of doing a few things tonight. So tomorrow feels lighter when it arrives. If this brought back a memory of your mother, grandmother, or a home that always seemed quietly under control, subscribe and stay close. There are many more forgotten routines worth remembering, and many of them begin the same way this one did, with ordinary hands putting one room back in order before bed.